The Trudeau government puts forward yet another questionable privacy bill. I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. I'm starting to notice a trend, and it's not a good one. The current government really likes to crack down on people's personal liberties and privacy. And if you need evidence for that, look at the swath of bills that have come out of the Trudeau government as of late. Today we'll be talking about the latest installment in this saga. The National Post reports that the government's proposed Bill S-7, introduced in the Senate, aims to amend the Customs Act to dictate when custom officers can look through cell phones, tablets, laptops, and more. Now, this piece of legislation was created in response to a 2020 judgment by the Alberta Court of Appeal, which ruled that any examination of personal digital devices would be unconstitutional because the previous Customs Act didn't contain limits on why or how an agent may search a device. However, the Alberta Court of Appeal realized that banning searches outright could cause some very real national security issues, obviously. Now, what happened there was the Alberta court was trying to balance the personal liberties with the very real security threats that can happen from not having any guidelines there. So what they did was they suspended their decision for 1 year to give the federal government time to amend the Customs Act and to introduce limitations. Reasonable limitations. Now, for somebody hearing this for the first time, you may be on the side of the argument that says the government should never be able to check your personal devices under any circumstance, right? That's on one end. And on the other hand, you have the more authoritarian perspective, which says the government should be able to check them at any time for any reason. Both of these stances on the extreme would be wrong, though, not suited to the realities of the world. On one hand, with the government holding this complete power, they can abuse it. They can use it to profile people. They can use it to target political opponents who they don't like, as seen in other countries around the world. And on the flip side, if you're unable to search things under any circumstance, you could have very problematic situations where terrorists, troublemakers are running amok, and you might catch one of them. But, for example, you won't be able to see if they're working alone or with other people. But if you were able to search the devices, you could theoretically figure that out. And that's a benefit. This could also be true for spies and diplomats from countries who we're suspicious of, and they might have come for ulterior motives. There are cases that can be argued where it would make sense, and it'd be in the interest of national security, truly, to search people. Now, one must understand those are fringe cases. The vast majority of people at the airport or crossing the border would have no reason to have their personal electronic devices searched and looked through. So, you have to have a law that enables you to be smart, that saves the 99.9% of people passing through from the hassle, headache, and invasion of privacy, but allows the government to maneuver when a very real threat presents itself. In some extreme circumstances, searching a person's device could be the difference between stopping a terror plot or not, from weeding out who the associates are of that individual and not knowing, from stopping one single actor versus stopping an entire group who is coordinating an attack, for example. So the federal government was given 1 year to figure that equation out. There had to be a standard. But rather than take the time, the National Post reports, to fully consider what constitutes reasonable grounds for such a serious invasion of privacy, the Liberal government created an irresponsibly low threshold, and once again that's from the National Post, that offloads decision-making to individual border agents. And this is what gets me. Do you know what the bar is? It is, quote-unquote, reasonable general concern. So when an individual agent has that, a reasonable general concern, whatever that means, they will be able to search your devices. The Post goes on to say that this sort of dangerously vague, far-reaching, and easily abused standard is something you'd expect from maybe the Chinese Communist Party or Vladimir Putin, but not a liberal democracy that purports to protect basic rights. And I agree with that 100%. That standard is irrational. and it's open to interpretation at the individual agent level. What constitutes reasonable general concern can mean one thing for one agent and another for someone else. For some percentage of the foolish agents out there, they may think that me having a beard constitutes a general concern, and that will enable them to then check all my devices. Now, for another agent, a concern could be they found a bomb in your backpack. And for another agent, they maybe found a machete in your belt. And for another agent, it could mean you've eaten a type of candy cane that they don't like and they think that is suspect. To not have a clearly defined rules of engagement here is a disaster. I can only begin to imagine the amount of lawsuits the government would be hit with once the agents abuse that power. And the taxpayer dollars would then pay out the beneficiaries of that case. But without even going there, just imagine the type of invasions into personal privacy would be happening with such a crude standard. As we've talked about, the vast majority of individuals who are passing through these transit points do not have to be checked, and we're actually only filtering for extremists, people who pose real security threats, people who are violent. There has to be a higher bar than quote-unquote reasonable general concern. And even if that's the bar you want to use, it has to be better defined. What does that mean? The public has to understand it, the agents have to understand it, and the government has to understand it. But right now, nobody knows what that is. The article then goes on to write that even more concerning, Bill S-7 wouldn't only apply to Canadian border services, it would set the standard for searches by U.S. Homeland Security agents who conduct pre-clearance at Canadian airports. It would allow foreign officials to access Canadians' private data. And once again, to get access to your data, your photos, and anything else you have on your personal devices, what's the bar again? Essentially feeling weird about you. That's ridiculous. Now, I'm not a security expert, but let's just theorize some other criteria that would have perhaps made more sense here. First of all, if you find someone with weapons on them, then yes, I do think that could be grounds to search their devices. Who have they been talking to? Maybe get an indication as to why they've shown up with that gun, or that bomb, or that knife, or whatever it is that has literally flagged a direct security threat. How about also reserving this right to check devices and limiting it to people who have tangible, provable ties to extremist groups, whether that's on the far right or religious-based extremism? If we can prove that individuals are tied to groups like that, then perhaps it makes sense to check their devices. Maybe on a behavioral basis, if someone is sweating profusely, looking super nervous, always checking their back to observe if people are watching them, and you have that type of behavior on camera, then maybe it makes sense to talk to them and try to figure out what's making them so nervous. And then, if they can't produce a proper answer, then maybe it might make sense to check a device. In just a minute here, we've come up with some grounds that we can use to debate and further extrapolate and get to the bottom of a criteria that can be used to inform the border agent's decision making. Not just telling them, hey guys, feel free to abuse this power if you have a general concern. If you're catching a bad vibe, for example. I think the article used that. That's quite funny. But it is scary though. That's an incredibly insane benchmark to be putting to such a stringent power. So the article then goes on to write that the Canadian Civil Liberties Association has publicly criticized Bill S-7, writing that the quote-unquote very low and legally novel threshold of quote-unquote reasonable general concern for border officials to conduct a search of a traveler's personal electronic devices does not adequately protect travelers' privacy. Indeed, the threshold of reasonable general concern is a sniff test, not a standard. That's exactly correct. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association has been quite on point lately. They had issues too with Trudeau's Emergencies Act. They've had issues with some other things that he's put forward, and they're rightfully calling out this Bill S-7. It's just harebrained, to put it lightly. They've had a year to figure things out. And in that year, if the best you can come up with is reasonable general concern, you failed at your job as a policymaker and as a government. I think one of the most tragic things here about this story is that it is not known widely. And that's along with the swath of other bills that the Trudeau government has introduced to curb individual freedom and expression. This is concerning and it's a pattern. Every other month there's something coming out of that institution that is targeted at the average citizen and is being used to encroach upon basic rights. The paradox I'm trying to solve for is that if a government really thinks they deserve all this power, they better at least prove it and not be incompetent. But visibly, they're not showing signs of being able to handle it. If you've given yourself 1 year to figure out a criteria for using this search policy, and all you can come up with is a bad vibe, that doesn't give me confidence that you can use these powers wisely. And to close the loop on that point, even if the government did inspire confidence on my part, if you are a fan of the current administration and you do think they deserve to have these type of powers in place, they're not going to be there forever. There's no guarantee that the next ruling authority is going to be competent. So, once again, the question is, why arm the government with such a weapon if the potential for abuse is so high? This equation is not all that complicated. As we've talked about, there are fringe cases where it does make sense to search an individual's personal devices, matters that link directly and concretely to national security, not measures that give the average border agent the power to search someone because they gave them the wrong look, for example. This balance has to be established, and the government obviously needs more time to figure that out. So with that, it now brings us to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the material, be sure to leave a review and share. That'll help us grow. And you can find me online at perryplatform.org and on social media at perryplatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.